D. 24 July 1943. Somewhere over the North Sea, at 20,000 feet, a young RAF wireless operator reaches into a cardboard box and pulls out a bundle of what looks like ordinary kitchen tinfoil. He has been told almost nothing about what he is holding, only that at a signal from the pilot, he must post it through a small chute in the fuselage floor, one bundle every minute, for as long as the aircraft is over enemy territory. He does not know the name for it yet. Nobody in the crew does. Down below, on the Dutch and German coast, an entire defensive system built across 3 years and at staggering cost is about to fail in the space of about 90 seconds. The bundle leaves his hand and tumbles into the slipstream. Inside it are around 2,000 strips of black paper-backed aluminium foil, each one cut to a precise length of 27 centimetres, roughly the size of a dinner knife. As the wind catches them, they separate and begin to fall, tumbling and fluttering through the night air in a slow, drifting cloud. To anyone watching from the ground, nothing is visible at all. The strips are silent, weightless, and invisible in the dark. But 300 kilometres away, in a concrete bunker outside Hamburg, a German radar operator watching his Würzburg set is about to see his screen fill with light. What happens next does not involve a single bullet, bomb, or burst of gunfire. It is, in the truest sense, an ambush carried out with paper. Within minutes, the most sophisticated air defense network in the world, a chain of radar stations and night fighters that had been killing British bombers at a rate the Air Ministry considered unsustainable, effectively goes blind. Guns that had been shooting down one aircraft in every 20 now cannot find a single target. Night fighters that had been guided onto their prey with deadly precision are sent chasing echoes that do not exist. The bomber stream that should have been torn apart over the target sails through largely unmolested. This is the story of Window, the code name given to a small, cheap, almost laughably simple piece of British wartime engineering that did something no fighter aircraft, anti-aircraft gun, or armored tank ever managed. It did not destroy the enemy's machinery. It destroyed the enemy's ability to see. And, in doing so, it changed the character of the air war over Germany more profoundly than almost any weapon built during the conflict, despite the fact that it was, at its heart, nothing more than scrap metal cut to size and dropped out of an airplane. By the spring of 1943, RAF Bomber Command had a problem that was, by any rational measure, close to unsolvable. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris had built a force capable of sending hundreds, sometimes over 1,000, heavy bombers against German cities in a single night. The Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Sterlings of his command were the most powerful instrument of strategic bombing the world had yet seen, and yet that power meant little if the aircraft never reached their targets or never made it home. Losses on raids into Germany were climbing toward levels that, projected forward, would have made the entire bombing campaign mathematically impossible to sustain. Some squadrons were losing crews faster than training schools could produce replacements, and a crew member's statistical chance of completing a full tour of 30 operations was, by mid-1943, uncomfortably close to a coin toss survived several times over. The reason for this was a German air defense system of genuine technical brilliance, built under the direction of General Joseph Kammhuber. It consisted of overlapping boxes of radar coverage running the length of the European coast from northern France to Denmark, each one equipped with a Freya radar for long-range detection and a pair of Würzburg sets for close tracking, one locked onto the approaching bomber and the other guiding a night fighter into position behind it. Around cities such as Hamburg alone, no fewer than 15 of these radar boxes were arrayed, supported by 9 night fighter airfields in the immediate vicinity. A bomber crossing into this web was tracked from the moment it appeared on a Freya screen roughly 120 kilometers out, handed off to a Würzburg operator who could fix its position to within a few hundred meters, and then matched, almost mechanically, to a waiting Messerschmitt or Junkers night fighter armed with its own short-range Liechtenstein radar. Existing British countermeasures had achieved only partial success against this. Devices with names like Mandrel and Monica could jam certain frequencies or warn a crew that a fighter was nearby, but they were blunt instruments against a layered system, and some, like Monica, would later prove to be actively dangerous once the Germans learned to home in on their transmissions. What was needed was not a sharper tool, but something that attacked the very foundation the entire German system depended on: a radar's basic ability to tell the difference between one solid object and another. Air Marshal Harris and his staff knew of just such a solution. It had been sitting, fully designed and tested, in a government safe for more than a year, because someone in Whitehall had decided that the moment the technique was used, the enemy would copy it, and Britain's own cities, already scarred by the Blitz, would suffer the consequences twice over. The science behind Window had been understood since the earliest days of radar research, and the device itself was almost embarrassing in its simplicity once you knew the principle. A radar set works by sending out a pulse of radio energy and listening for the tiny fraction that bounces back off a solid object, in this case an aircraft's metal skin. The size of that echo depends on how effectively the object reflects radio waves of that particular wavelength. Engineers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment in Malvern, working under men such as Robert Cockburn, realized that a strip of metal cut to exactly half the wavelength of the radar trying to detect it would resonate with the incoming pulse and throw back an echo many times larger than its actual physical size would suggest, much as a wine glass struck at precisely the right pitch will ring far louder than its weight implies. The German Würzburg sets operated on a wavelength of around 53 centimetres, so the British settled on strips 27 centimetres long, about the length of a table knife, cut from black paper bonded to a thin layer of aluminium foil. Each strip on its own was a curiosity. Dropped by the thousand from a bomber, they became something closer to a weapon. A single bundle released from an aircraft would spread into a drifting cloud roughly a kilometre across within a minute, and because each strip produced a radar echo comparable in size to that of an actual bomber, a stream of 700 aircraft, each dropping bundles at a rate of 1 per minute, could in theory generate the radar signature of many thousands of phantom targets. To a German controller staring at his scope, the screen did not simply become cluttered. It became a blizzard, in the words of observers at the time, a wall of white returns in which no human being could distinguish a genuine four-engined bomber from a falling scrap of paper. To understand why something so unsophisticated could defeat a system built around precision engineering, it helps to think of the radar screen itself, a circular glass display known as a cathode ray tube, sweeping a thin green line around its face every few seconds and leaving a faint glow wherever a returning echo struck it. In normal operation, a controller watching that screen would see perhaps 1 or 2 glowing points moving steadily across it, each one a bomber, each one trackable, each one assignable to a particular night fighter. What Window did was multiply those points by a factor of 1,000 or more within minutes, filling the same dark glass with a constellation of static, slow-drifting smears that looked, for all the world, like the very aircraft the controller was trying to find. There was no way to filter the false from the real, because the underlying physics that made an aluminium strip glow on the screen was identical to the physics that made a Lancaster's wing glow on the screen. The radar was not malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what it had been built to do, and that, perversely, was the entire problem. Production was kept under extraordinary secrecy even after the decision to deploy it was finally taken in the summer of 1943, following a meeting attended by Winston Churchill himself in mid-July. Factories turned out millions of strips, packed into standard bundles for distribution to squadrons literally days before the first operational use, with many aircrew receiving no briefing on the device beyond an instruction card taped near the dispensing chute. The simplicity of the manufacturing process, foil bonded to paper and guillotined to length, meant that quantities sufficient to blanket entire bomber streams could be produced by ordinary printing and packaging firms rather than specialist defense contractors, a fact that says as much about the genius of the idea as any of its technical specifications. The first operational use came on the night of 24th to 25th July 1943, during the opening raid of what would become known as the Battle of Hamburg. 791 aircraft took off from airfields across eastern England, and, for the first time, crews began posting bundles of window through their dispensing chutes as they crossed the enemy coast. The results were almost immediate and, to the men flying that night, almost eerie in how little opposition they encountered compared to previous raids into heavily defended German airspace. German anti-aircraft batteries, deprived of accurate radar tracking, reverted to firing largely unaimed barrages into the night sky, while night fighter controllers, unable to separate genuine targets from the drifting foil, struggled to direct their aircraft onto anything at all. Of the bombers dispatched that night, only 12 failed to return, a loss rate dramatically lower than crews had been bracing for. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more to come on just how far this single roll of foil went on to change the air war. German accounts from the period describe the confusion in stark terms. Albert Speer, the Reich's Minister for Armaments, later recalled the shock among the leadership when the new device first appeared, describing how anti-aircraft guns that had previously found their targets with precision were suddenly rendered unable to track the bombers at all, and how the success of that first raid was, in his recollection, repeated and intensified on every subsequent night the technique was used. Records from Luftwaffe fighter controllers describe operators reporting hundreds of contacts where perhaps 200 aircraft actually flew, and pilots being vectored toward echoes that dissolved into nothing as they closed. Across the full sequence of raids that made up the Battle of Hamburg, more than 17,000 sorties were flown over subsequent months with a loss rate that fell to around 4% overall, a figure that, while still grim by any peacetime standard, represented a transformation compared to what crews had endured earlier that year. The German response was instructive precisely because there was so little of it available in the short term. Engineers in Germany had, in fact, identified the same vulnerability in their own radar systems years earlier and had deliberately avoided alerting the Allies to it by never using a similar technique themselves, under the codename Duple, for fear that the British would copy the idea and turn it back on German air defenses, exactly as eventually happened. When window finally appeared, the irony was bitter. The Germans had effectively been deterred by their own foresight. It would take Kammhuber's engineers many months to begin fielding adequate countermeasures, principally a shift toward radars operating on different wavelengths and new tactics that relied less on precise individual tracking and more on visual interception methods such as wild sow, in which fighters hunted bombers illuminated by searchlights and the glow of burning cities below. The Americans, watching closely, adopted their own version of the same idea almost immediately, calling it chaff, a name that has stuck in English-speaking militaries ever since and remains in use today, in radically updated form, aboard modern warships and combat aircraft. What makes the comparison so stark is how little it cost relative to what it achieved. A bundle of window strips weighed only a few hundred grams and cost a small fraction of what a single anti-aircraft shell cost the Germans to fire in retaliation, and yet its effect on a single night's raid could be measured in dozens of aircraft and hundreds of aircrew who came home instead of becoming casualties. No German equivalent existed in the field at the time precisely because the Germans understood the principle too well and feared its consequences too much, an almost unique case in the war, where deterrence through self-restraint left one side defenseless against the very weapon it had invented. The deeper legacy of window lies less in any single raid than in what it revealed about the nature of modern warfare. It demonstrated, for the first time on a massive scale, that an enemy's sensors could be defeated more cheaply and more completely than the enemy's weapons themselves, a lesson that has shaped military thinking ever since in the form of electronic countermeasures, stealth technology, and the entire discipline now known as electronic warfare. Bomber Command's official historians have noted that window's introduction, alongside other innovations of that period, did not single-handedly win the air war, but it bought time, aircrew, and aircraft at a moment when Bomber Command's casualty curve was heading toward a point that some senior officers genuinely believed would force the campaign to be abandoned. The psychological impact on German defenses was, by most accounts, just as significant as the material one, with controllers and gun crews describing a creeping sense of helplessness that no amount of additional radar stations could immediately fix, because the problem was not a shortage of equipment, but a fundamental flaw in how that equipment perceived the world. It is worth being honest about the limits of what Window achieved, because the temptation with a story this dramatic is to overstate it. Window did not make Bomber Command's aircraft invulnerable, and the Battle of Hamburg still cost dozens of crews their lives across its full run of raids. Within months, German engineers had begun fielding new tactics and equipment that clawed back some of the advantage Window had taken from them. And by 1944, the loss rate on deep penetration raids into Germany had crept upwards again as the Luftwaffe adapted. Nor is it possible to state with total precision how many lives Window saved, since Bomber Command's casualty figures depend on comparing actual losses against a projected rate that can only ever be an estimate, built from the trajectory of previous months rather than a controlled experiment. What can be said with confidence is the shape of the change, sharp, sudden, and coinciding precisely with the device's introduction, in a way that left little room for any explanation beyond the one Albert Speer himself offered from the German side after the war. Examples of the original window strips, along with the dispensing equipment used to deploy them, can today be seen in the collections of the RAF Museum and the Imperial War Museum, unremarkable-looking strips of foil and paper that, set beside the Lancaster bombers and Messerschmitt night fighters displayed nearby, look almost absurdly modest for what they achieved. Return, for a moment, to that wireless operator over the North Sea, posting bundles of foil through a chute he had barely been told the purpose of. He had no way of knowing that the strips falling away beneath his aircraft were, in that instant, doing more to keep him alive than any gun turret, any evasive maneuver, any scrap of armor plating bolted to his Lancaster's fuselage. He was not firing a weapon. He was unmaking one. He was taking apart, strip by drifting strip, a system of radar boxes and trained controllers and waiting night fighters that had cost Germany years to build and a fortune to maintain, and he was doing it with something that, dropped on a kitchen floor, a child might have mistaken for Christmas decorations. That is the strange, almost paradoxical power of Window. It did not blow anything up. It did not kill a single enemy soldier directly. What it did was quieter and, in its way, more devastating. It took away the enemy's eyes. A radar system that cannot distinguish a bomber from a scrap of paper is not a damaged radar system. It is, for every practical purpose, no radar system at all. The guns were still there. The night fighters were still flying. The trained crews manning the Würzburg scopes were still alert and still skilled. None of that mattered, because the information flowing into their hands had become noise, and an air defense network drowning in false signals is exactly as useful as no network whatsoever. On that first Hamburg raid alone, of the 791 aircraft dispatched, only 12 failed to return, a loss rate so far below what crews had been bracing for that the figure was, for some time, treated with suspicion at debriefing. Across the full sequence of raids making up the Battle of Hamburg, the overall loss rate settled at around 4% of sorties flown, a number that sounds modest only until set against the trajectory Bomber Command had been on before Window arrived. Precisely how many aircraft and crews were spared by comparing that outcome against the losses earlier raids into similarly defended airspace would have predicted remains, as with so much of this history, a matter of estimate rather than certainty, since no controlled comparison was possible in the middle of a war. What is not in doubt is the shape of the curve. Bomber losses that had been climbing toward an unsustainable peak in early 1943 fell away sharply the moment foil began falling from the sky, and they did so not because British bombers became harder to hit, not because their crews became braver or more skilled, but because the eyes searching for them had, in the space of a single raid, gone effectively blind. There is something almost poetic in the fact that one of the most consequential weapons of the Second World War's air campaign was not a weapon at all in any conventional sense. It carried no explosive, it pulled no trigger, it struck no target, it was paper and foil, cut to a length decided by mathematics rather than malice, dropped by the thousand into the night sky over Germany by men who, in most cases, never fully understood what they were holding. And yet on the night of July 24, 1943, and on dozens of nights that followed, it did something that anti-aircraft guns and fighter aircraft and years of German engineering could not prevent. It made an entire air defense